Okay, welcome back. We looked at creativity and innovation as in a precursory way. And we're now looking at what are underlying mental models that can lead us to innovate and create in different ways. I'm going back to chapter 3 of the book and just trying to understand how can we use our brain to create new solutions in a way that managers are called to do. Managers are called to problem solve, right? And getting back to my favorite props. If we want to maximize, we solve problems of maximization. If we want to create better solutions where everyone can thrive, we can probably do that too. So what are some of the underlying models that can potentially help us create better, manage better?
I think when we talk about it, it's those, you write about it in your book, but it's those 4 specific drives. It's the drive to acquire, the drive to bond, the drive to comprehend, and the drive to defend. And right now in the economistic mode where you see the nice cut piece of bread, we're only focusing on the drive to acquire, and everything else falls into that. Like, they're not individual drives, rather than the drive to acquire drives everything, and your drive to bond, your drive to defend, your drive to comprehend are second to that, versus a way to really value the whole human and in turn create wholesome corporations is to realize that each drive is independent of one another, and that by focusing on bettering each of those drives rather than in tandem with one another, you can really create a dignified person.
And I think when companies can abandon the notion that these drives of people are all driven towards the need to acquire, or there's an overarching need for maximization, and they can abandon that and treat them independently, you see a lot more innovation. Like, one of the companies, I think, that I'm not certain, but I believe GE has an incentive and a reward program where they allow their employees 1 day a week to work on any problem. And that's fulfilling for multiple reasons. Chapter 3 talks a lot about how we're actually hardwired to innovate and create, and how that actually creates like little internal rewards for ourselves. But they're not necessarily benefiting from that right away. That is something that would probably eventually lead to their bottom line through innovation, but it's not an expectation, and it's not specifically to feed that need, if that makes sense. And there's a number of companies that we see doing this with their employees and creating these kind of incentives where they are trying to balance the different needs of their workforce.
Yeah, and you see that a lot with companies now being like, well, we have flexible working policies where if you have a family, maybe you work 7 to 3, or maybe you work from home twice a week, and trying to really make sure that there's still a balance. But at the end of the day, for some of those companies, that balance still involves that you're still on your computer, you're still working. And I think there's almost a guilt that humans have created now that I'm working from home, and even if I'm supposed to be like working from home to be with my kids or to handle things, I now have to work even longer into the night. And on a personal note, like my boyfriend works from home, and sometimes he works till 9 or 10 at night because it's this guilt that his company, I don't know if they created it or they've sort of, it's just been harnessed over the years that he should just constantly be working. So I think that while companies are getting there, they're still putting the acquire at the highest while pretending that they've now valued you by giving you unlimited vacation, work from home abilities, remote options, but in turn it's still not valuing each individual drive. It's still all within one drive.
Right. So there's still this maximization paradigm, right? The maximizing sandwich. Right? More.
Right.
More is driving any kind of innovation. So the work that your boyfriend does, or that you do, is oftentimes evaluated based on how much can you contribute to more, whatever it is, more market share, more sales, more of something, right? And it doesn't matter what kind of quality you're producing. Right? And then the assessment of quality is almost difficult to do when you have already the parameter of more.
Right.
So how do you assess quality, right? And I think this goes back to what does it mean to lead a good life, to live a human life, to be dignified, to have a quality of life or well-being, right? And I think many people are not clear on this question, and they rarely have that reflection, and so they are trapped in this narrative, in this story that more is better, that he has to work until 9, 10 o'clock, because he feels guilty.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I think even going on that with the more, you see that drive to acquire in places where maybe it even shouldn't be. So, for example, with hospitals, there's this push for RVUs, and so people do procedures that maybe don't have to be done, but that has more money than taking the quality time to understand a patient's problem and getting to know the patient and being like, I spent an hour with them, and yes, that didn't cost as much as maybe a surgery, but the surgery wasn't necessary. And I think that we've pushed so hard the more thing that we've been talking about, that we have stopped valuing humans as consumers, humans as employees, and just the all-around person. And I think it's the guilt of society that we've pushed so far into, that's become ingrained, and we haven't realized how unhappy we become just benefiting corporations without benefiting ourselves.
Well, it's funny because if you look at the happiest people, it's oftentimes not the richest people, right? And oftentimes what you see in terms of happiness, people that report the highest levels of happiness are the ones that are balancing,
Right.
that don't work that much, that don't have that much, right? It's having versus being, right? And in fact, the ones that are the richest are oftentimes the most scared. And there's this narrative that's sort of going on that sort of pushes American society specifically, but all Anglo-Saxon societies, plus the global society overall, which that model dominates, towards a certain assumption set that, yes, more is better. And typically that ends with resentment, with the kind of backlash that we're seeing now with the nationalist kind of movements, with all kinds of ways where people reclaim their dignity because they don't feel seen. Right? Many people would say Brexit and the Trump vote and all these other nationalist votes are coming from people that don't feel heard and seen and valued. Because they don't have and they don't want more, and maybe they don't have an access to more. And so they want to sort of reestablish themselves as a community, right?
Oh, I was just going to add, even in in business school, for example, I kind of felt like a fish out of water in business school at times because there was an obsession with productivity, which has led to a lot of mass migration and people who feel that their jobs have been displaced, but that productivity has trumped quality or actual output, and it's resulted in a lot of displacement, job displacement, because people are turning instead to machinery, and they're not figuring out the human element of that and incorporating real jobs or fulfilling jobs in that. So that's another reason why a lot of people feel very disgruntled, because they feel that they're being replaced or unheard in that sense. And then that same productivity is completely aimless, because this is like a general rule, but when you're studying for an hour straight, they say every 50 minutes you should take a 10-minute break, and that way you can actually absorb the knowledge, which just underlines the need for balance. You can only be productive so much before you actually reach a burnout point or a tipping point where you just are filled with resentment or a lack of motivation.
And where you're seen as a human being again, not as a machine, right? Because in some way that's what's occurring in many cases. Is like you're a human machine, and you're never going to be as efficient as a machine. And therefore either you're going to be replaced or you're only going to have a job if you're cheaper than the machine. So that kind of notion is creating and breeding a lot of resentment in many different ways. It doesn't get the best out of people in terms of the kind of productivity that we're talking about now, because management and organizations are not necessarily judged anymore on efficiency and effectiveness only. They're judged by the ethicality, by the why they're doing what they're doing. And many organizations don't have a good answer. Many managers don't have a good answer. And so people in those organizations cannot be expected to have a good answer. And if you don't have a good answer to the question why, what happens? You get disillusioned. You disengage, right? You think it's pointless. Life really makes no sense. The job doesn't make no sense. So you go back, and you don't really want to be part of that organization. And that's one of the big problems that I think is sort of set of this book and the whole conversation in this class is like, are we organizing the best way possible? Clearly we are facing massive, almost like existential problems as a species. So are we doomed?
I would hope not.
So what is it that can save us in some way? What can help us do that? That's here. It's our brain. It's understanding how we have been thinking, how we have been using the gray matter. And much of it is story guided, right? We're not fully rational. We're not able to process all the information out there. We actually have very limited processing power. And that's why stories are so important, because they can guide our attention. And the more we have attention towards the right kind of problems that are important to our survival, we can probably create solutions for it. But that requires that we have an understanding of the underlying narrative of what we actually want to achieve. That means, who are we? What do we want in life, right? And do you want more? Do you want a good life? Do you want better? And when you ask that way, I think nobody will say more.
Right, they'll say better life.
Better, yeah. It's better. I don't need more toys. I don't need a bigger house. I don't need more cars, because I can't even drive them,
Right.
They're going to stand around. And one of the biggest industries that we have here in the US is storage.
Wow.
That's
There's
a growth
lot of
industry.
money to be made in the 90s in storage.
And even now.
Yeah.
People have too much stuff. We're very good at acquiring stuff, but then we don't know what to do with it. So storage is the solution. It's perverse, right? It's like you pay and work and do stuff or work to get stuff that you ultimately don't need or cannot use. And you decide to pay for that to be in storage. So the perversion of this whole model, I think, needs to become much more obvious. And I think it's becoming more obvious to the generations that you're speaking to, generation millennials and Generation Z and whatever we want to call it. But I think even the baby boomers and everybody else, it's like, this is just not workable. This is not a working model for how we should organize ourselves, the groups, the organizations, and society at large. And what I'm hoping to do with this book, instead of giving a much more simple way of looking at, you know what, if we focused on the right kind of problems that help us understand how we can survive better, then most likely we can make it. If we keep looking in the wrong spot, like the drunken person that looks for his keys under the light, but he dropped them somewhere else. You know that?
Yeah.
That's, I think, what currently CEOs are doing. And we're really trying to create new solutions to this old problem of maximization. And it's the wrong problem. We're doing it very well. We're creating more maximizing strategies, more maximizing products of some sort that maximize some aspect of life that we really don't care that much about. And if we were able to shift our mind, shift our understanding of who we are and come to better and say, all right, the real challenge for us is to come into the safe and just zone of operation where we can all thrive, like the Business Roundtable people are saying they want to do, then most likely we're not doomed. We can manage, right? And I think this is the biggest task that managers in this era face, how to make that happen. How to empower everyone in the organization to think along those lines, to be creative along those lines, to innovate around those lines. So this, students, is the challenge for you. It's the challenge for everyone in this world, pretty much, I would say. And how we think about ourselves does play a foundational role. So this is what the point was of this discussion of Chapter 3. I hope you dig deeper and that we can have more of this informed conversation going forward.